Welcome to the Darkling Radio, a channel where every story pulls you deeper into the shadows. Here we bring you terrifying first-person horror tales told in an immersive style that will keep you awake long after the video ends. Daniel Cross and Evelyn Hart thought they were only breaking into an old forgotten property on the edge of town. But what waited inside wasn't dust, rot, or decay. It was something alive, something watching, and once they crossed the threshold, the house refused to let them leave. I should have never entered that place, and now when I think back to that night, I realize it was the exact moment everything in my life began to unravel. The abandoned house stood at the edge of town, a rotting skeleton of wood and stone surrounded by overgrown weeds and tangled trees that blocked the moonlight. I had passed by it countless times during the day, always staring at it longer than I should have, feeling its emptiness pulling at me. People whispered stories about it, some claiming it was cursed, others saying no one had lived there for decades because those who did vanished without explanation. I never believed those stories fully, but I always wondered why the house seemed to sit in a pocket of silence, as though the land itself rejected life. That night I gave in to curiosity. I told myself I was only going to look around, just to see the inside and prove to myself that it was nothing more than a crumbling forgotten house. I knew trespassing wasn't right, but the thrill of doing something forbidden made my pulse quicken. The fence surrounding the property was rusted and weak, sagging under its own weight, and when I climbed over it, the metal groaned beneath me like a warning. My boots landed on the other side in thick, damp weeds, and the air immediately felt heavier, colder. It was as if the house knew I had crossed a line. Walking toward it, every step made me uneasy. My feet crunched against dead leaves, but the sound didn't echo the way it should have in the open night. Instead, it felt muted, swallowed by something unseen. The closer I got, the more unnatural the air felt. The stillness wasn't normal. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted, and even the wind seemed to stop at the edges of the property. My flashlight beam cut across broken windows, peeling paint, and boards nailed haphazardly across sections of the walls, but none of it looked ordinary. It looked staged, as though the house was pretending to be abandoned when in reality, something still lived inside. When I reached the front porch, the wood sagged under my weight, brittle from rain and time. I hesitated at the door. My hand hovered above the knob, and for a brief second I thought I heard something moving inside, soft, slow, like the drag of feet across a wooden floor. I told myself it was only my imagination, nerves playing tricks, and pushed the thought away. But the moment I touched the handle, a chill shot through me, colder than anything I had ever felt. The metal wasn't just cold from the night air, it felt alive, like holding the hand of something long dead. I swallowed hard and forced the door open. The hinges screamed, the sound echoing far too loud in the silence. Dust spiraled in the beam of my flashlight, and the smell hit me instantly: damp wood, mold, and something sour underneath, like rot hidden deep within the walls. I stepped inside, my boots pressing into a thick layer of dust that seemed untouched for years. At first glance, the house looked empty. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, lined with peeling wallpaper and crooked frames that hung by rusted nails. But the more I stared, the more wrong it felt. I expected everything to be still, but my light revealed faint trails across the dust. Thin lines where something had been dragged across the floor. My chest tightened as I crouched down. They weren't scratches from animals. They were footprints. Bare feet, small and delicate, pressed into the dust in a way that looked disturbingly fresh. They weren't faded like something left long ago. They looked recent, as though someone had walked through just hours earlier. My throat went dry as I followed the trail with my eyes. The prints led deeper into the hallway, disappearing into the darkness. I told myself again that I should leave, that trespassing was a bad idea, but there was a strange pull inside me. I wanted to know who had been here, why they were here, and why the house felt like it was waiting for me. I lifted the flashlight higher, its weak beam trembling from the unsteady grip of my hand. The walls seemed to close in as I walked further, the silence pressing against my ears until I could hear nothing but my own breathing. Then I noticed something that made my stomach twist. At the very end of the hallway, beyond where the footprints vanished, there was a shadow stretching across the wall. It wasn't mine. My body was frozen in place, my light shaking as I tried to understand what I was seeing. The shadow didn't move, didn't shift, even though my flashlight beam flickered across it. It was tall, misshapen, and it clung to the wall as if it belonged there. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it echoing in my skull. I took a single step closer, and the boards groaned loudly under my weight. The shadow's head turned. My entire body froze as the shadow shifted on the wall, though there was nothing in front of it to cast it. I wanted to believe it was only my mind twisting under fear, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. The head of the figure angled unnaturally, and the arms seemed far too long, dragging down the wall like melted shapes. My instinct told me to turn and leave, to run before I made a mistake I couldn't undo, yet something in me refused to move. My legs carried me forward, step by step, as though the house itself was pulling me deeper. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. I remembered seeing a door halfway down from the outside, but inside it seemed to go on endlessly. The air grew heavier, clinging to my skin with dampness that made me shiver. My flashlight flickered, and each time it dimmed, I thought I saw the shadow detach from the wall, reaching across the floor toward me. But when the light steadied, the wall was bare, leaving me unsure of what I had really seen. When I finally reached the end, the prints in the dust became clearer. They no longer looked like a single set of footprints. There were more small ones, large ones, overlapping, circling back as if several people had been pacing here for hours. I knelt down to examine them, and that's when I noticed something that turned my stomach. Some of the footprints were pressed into the dust, the way they should have been, but others bulged outward, as if they had risen from beneath the floor. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The beam darted across the walls, and that was when I saw the scratches. Every section of wallpaper was torn through with jagged lines, long and violent. Some were high above my head, as if something had dragged claws across the walls. Others were clustered low, gouged deep into the wood near the baseboards. I shone the light closer and realized something worse underneath the peeled layers of wallpaper. Faint carvings covered the walls. Symbols, circles intersecting with jagged shapes, etched deep into the plaster like someone had desperately tried to leave behind a warning. I forced myself to look away, focusing on the footprints again, but the sight of them made my head pound. My thoughts grew scattered, like whispers brushing against my ears just outside of understanding. The more I stared at the overlapping prints, the more I felt like they weren't showing where someone had been walking, but where they were waiting. I lifted the flashlight and found a door. It was different from the others I had passed, heavier, thicker, with a surface scarred by long streaks of red. The stains glistened faintly under the light, still wet in some places. I reached out before I could stop myself, my fingertips brushing against the wood. It was sticky. Every part of me screamed not to open it, but I couldn't turn away. My hand tightened on the knob, which was colder than ice, burning against my palm. The hinges groaned when I pushed, the sound cutting into the silence like a scream. The room beyond was dark, so much darker than the rest of the house, as though the light itself refused to enter. I raised the flashlight and stepped inside. Dust thickened in my throat, and the smell of iron hit me hard, sharp and metallic. The beam illuminated the center of the room, where something stood waiting. It was a chair, simple, wooden, and splintered with age. Around it, the floor was covered in more of those carved symbols, overlapping into a chaotic mess that pulsed with something I couldn't explain. My light trembled over the chair's surface, and I saw stains running down its legs, dark and dried. They spread into the grooves on the floor, as though the chair had been sitting in the middle of some ritual, but it wasn't the chair that made me stagger backward. Against the far wall stood a tall mirror, its glass cracked in jagged lines that split my reflection into pieces. I stepped closer despite myself, and my chest tightened. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't right. The face was mine, but the eyes were empty, black pits that swallowed the beam of my light. I moved slightly to the side, but my reflection didn't. It kept staring, unblinking, with its head tilted in the same unnatural way I had seen in the shadow. Then, slowly, its lips began to curl upward. I stumbled back from the mirror, my breath ragged as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. My reflection should have followed me, should have copied every twitch and movement, but it stood perfectly still, its head tilted further to one side, as though bones were snapping in its neck, and the black voids where its eyes should have been seemed to draw me in. I raised my flashlight higher, trying to force the light to cut through the wrongness, but it only seemed to make the reflection darker, heavier, like a shadow feeding on the glow. My knees felt weak, and every instinct screamed to run, yet my body rooted itself to the spot, paralyzed by the silent grin spreading across my own twisted face in the glass. The smile stretched wider until it didn't look human anymore. Teeth gleamed sharp in the broken patches of the mirror, and my reflection leaned forward, pressing its palms flat against the glass. The surface rippled faintly, as though it were water and not glass at all. My heart hammered so violently I thought it might tear free from my chest. I staggered backward, bumping into the chair in the center of the room. The wood groaned under my weight, and the sound echoed unnaturally long, filling the air until it seemed to seep from the walls themselves. I forced my eyes away from the mirror, gripping the chair to steady myself. The carvings on the floor seemed to pulse under the weak beam of my flashlight. At first, I thought it was only my vision swimming from fear, but the longer I stared, the clearer it became. The lines weren't still. They shifted, curling and straightening like living veins etched into the wood. The longer I looked, the more the patterns seemed to form shapes, faces with hollow eyes, mouths stretched open in silent screams, bodies twisted into impossible angles. My stomach lurched, and I pulled the light away, but even without it, I could still feel them moving beneath my boots. The air pressed tighter against me, growing heavier, harder to breathe. A faint sound began to rise, so soft I thought it was my own pulse at first. It was a whisper, low and rasping, slipping through the cracks in the room. I spun toward the door, desperate to leave, but the knob that had been so cold before was now burning hot. I yanked my hand back, skin stinging. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices that circled the room in a language I couldn't understand. I turned back to the mirror and my stomach dropped. The reflection was gone. The glass stood cracked and broken, but it no longer showed me at all. Instead, the surface shimmered faintly like a doorway into somewhere else. Shapes moved in the darkness on the other side, tall, thin figures shifting just beyond sight. For a brief second I thought I saw faces pressing against the glass, skinless and hollow, before sinking back into the shadows. I didn't wait. I kicked the chair aside and ran for the door, slamming my shoulder against it until it gave way. The hallway outside was pitch black, my flashlight the only thin thread keeping me from being swallowed whole. The walls groaned as though the house itself was alive, stretching and twisting around me. The wallpaper curled and peeled before my eyes, exposing more symbols carved into the wood beneath. My footsteps echoed louder than before, too loud, as if someone else was running with me. I forced myself deeper into the hall, desperate to find the way I had come in, but the house seemed to rearrange itself. Corridors bent in directions that made no sense. Doors appeared where none had been before, their frames crooked, their handles rattling as though something inside wanted to come out. The whispers followed me everywhere, crawling through the walls, through the floor, filling my head until I couldn't hear my own thoughts. I turned a corner and froze. The hallway ahead stretched long, lined with mirrors on both sides. Each one was cracked and filthy, yet they all reflected me. But it wasn't really me. Every reflection moved just a little too slow, a fraction of a second behind my movements. Some stared back with wide, grinning mouths, others with black voids for eyes. My heart pounded as I tried not to look, but the reflections drew me in. I lifted my flashlight and saw something that made the blood in my veins turn cold. One of the reflections didn't lag behind. It wasn't warped, cracked, or distorted. It was perfect, too perfect. It stood still while I trembled, and slowly, deliberately, it raised its hand not to mirror me, but to beckon me forward. I wanted to turn around, to run the other way, but my legs felt heavy, as though the floorboards beneath me were clinging to my boots. The reflection that beckoned me forward didn't move after that. It stood frozen, its hand still raised, its face to calm, to certain, as though it knew I would eventually obey. My flashlight shook in my hand as I forced myself to take a step back, but the moment I did, every mirror lining the hallway shuddered. The glass rattled violently, cracks deepening with sharp pops that echoed down the corridor. Dust rained from the ceiling. My own fractured reflections jerked and twitched like broken puppets, each one twisting into new positions that I hadn't made. I staggered forward instinctively, my back pressed to the opposite wall, my light darting from one reflection to the next. Their movements no longer matched mine at all. Some grinned wide with mouths that stretched too far. Others tilted their heads until their necks bent at impossible angles. One slammed its palms against the glass with such force that the mirror splintered outward. Yet the surface never broke completely. My chest tightened, every breath ragged as I tried to push forward, needing to reach the end of the hallway no matter what waited. The floor creaked beneath me with each step, but it wasn't just creaking anymore. The boards bent downward, sagging as though the weight of the house was pulling me under. My flashlight beam swept across the floor and caught glimpses of movement between the cracks. Hands, small, pale hands pressed against the underside of the boards, clawing upward as though something beneath the floor was trying to crawl out. My stomach lurched as splinters began to rise, and I ran, my footsteps pounding against the wood while the sound of cracking and scratching chased me. At last, the hallway ended in a crooked door. My hand closed around the knob, slick with moisture, and I pulled it open, shoving myself inside before I could hesitate. The door slammed shut on its own, rattling against the frame. I turned, but the knob was gone. Just a blank slab of wood sealed tightly behind me. The room I had entered was larger, wider, and suffocatingly dark. I swept my flashlight across it, and the beam caught on strange shapes that made my skin crawl. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with mirrors, dozens of them, all different sizes and frames. Some were tall and elegant with ornate carvings, others cracked and simple, but every inch of wall was reflective glass. My stomach churned as the light revealed countless versions of me staring back. None of them matched. Some looked older, some younger, some bruised and broken, others smiling with teeth that weren't mine. I pressed my hand against the wall, trying to ground myself, but even the cold glass beneath my palm rippled faintly, like water disturbed by a breeze. My reflection directly in front of me tilted its head slowly, just like the shadow I had seen earlier, and then raised its hand. This time, I watched in horror as it placed its palm flat against the glass, exactly where mine was. A jolt of cold shot through me, stabbing into my skin. I ripped my hand away, gasping, and stumbled back. The mirrors began to hum. A low vibrating sound filled the room, rattling through my bones. Cracks spread across the surfaces like spiderwebs, but none of them shattered. Instead, the reflections inside grew clearer, sharper, until it felt less like I was looking at mirrors and more like I was staring through windows into other places. In one, I saw myself standing in the same room but surrounded by shadows pressing close. In another, I was sitting in the wooden chair I'd seen earlier, my wrists bound, my face slack and lifeless. I tore my eyes away, but everywhere I looked, there was another vision of myself trapped, broken, or worse. Then, from the far corner of the room, one reflection stepped forward. It moved through its glass frame as though it were a curtain, its body sliding into the room without a sound. It looked exactly like me, but its face twisted slowly into that same unnatural smile I had seen in the cracked mirror. Its eyes were black pits, hollow and endless. My light shook violently in my grip, the beam bouncing across countless faces of myself, each one now grinning back. I tried to run to the other side of the room, searching for another door, another exit, anything but the moment my reflection fully stepped free from the mirror, every other version of me lifted their hands in unison. The sound of glass scraping filled the air as dozens of reflections began pressing against their frames, trying to push through. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart pounding so hard it hurt. My double took another slow step toward me, its grin stretching wider than human skin should allow. And then, in a voice I couldn't hear but somehow understood, every reflection mouthed the same silent word: "Stay." The silence after that word was unbearable. My ears rang as though the sound had been screamed inside my skull, even though no noise had actually reached the air. The room full of mirrors pulsed with a life of its own, the humming vibrating through the glass, through the floor, and through my chest. I backed away, but there was nowhere left to go. Every wall was covered, every reflection pressing closer against its frame, each version of me staring with eyes that weren't mine. The double that had stepped free from the mirror moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps soundless on the floor. I aimed my flashlight directly at it, but the beam didn't weaken it. Instead, the light seemed to sink into its hollow eyes, feeding them until they glowed faintly with a deep, unnatural darkness. My grip tightened around the flashlight, as if it were the only real thing keeping me tethered. But when I tried to back toward the center of the room, I realized the floor beneath me had changed. The carvings I had seen in the other room now stretched across the boards here, forming shapes and symbols beneath the dust, pulsing faintly with each beat of my heart. I glanced at the mirrors again and nearly lost control of my breath. The reflections weren't just of me anymore. Some of them showed people I had never seen before, faces pale and wide-eyed, mouths moving in silent screams. Their hands clawed at the glass from inside, their bodies distorted, pressing to get out. It was as if every soul that had ever been in this house had been swallowed whole, trapped in glass prisons, waiting for someone else to join them. The double stepped closer, so close now that I could see its skin wasn't skin at all. It rippled faintly like stretched plastic, too tight around a shape that was trying to force itself into being. Its grin split wider, and I realized its teeth weren't teeth but jagged shards of broken mirror, glistening wetly in the glow of my flashlight. I stumbled backward, my heel striking the edge of the chair behind me. My hands flailed for balance, but the moment I touched the wood, the symbols beneath my boots pulsed violently, filling the room with a blinding white flash. When the light faded, the mirrors weren't the same. They no longer showed warped versions of me. They showed reality, or what I thought was reality. I saw the front door of the house, wide open, moonlight spilling through. I saw the street outside, the fence, the freedom I desperately wanted. I ran toward the reflection, convinced that if one had opened before, maybe this one would too. But when I pressed my hand to the glass, the surface didn't ripple. It stayed solid, cold, unyielding. My reflection in that particular mirror didn't copy me this time either. It just stood there, on the other side, staring, and then it smiled. The walls groaned, and several mirrors cracked at once, splitting open wide enough for arms to reach through. Pale, trembling hands clawed at the air, stretching, grasping, some brushing against my jacket as I twisted away. More and more began to push free, their faces dragging behind them, mouths opening wide in silent howls. The sound returned suddenly, no longer silent, no longer restrained. It was a deafening chorus of screams, wails of people who shouldn't exist, and it tore through my skull until I thought it would split. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, but it didn't matter. The voices were inside me, pulling at my thoughts, unraveling every piece of who I was. I lifted my eyes one last time and saw the double standing directly in front of me. Its shadow stretched long across the floor, bending at impossible angles. It crouched low, its face inches from mine, and its mouth opened impossibly wide. From inside, I didn't see a throat, only a black tunnel lined with glass shards that reflected infinite versions of myself screaming back at me. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering to the floor and rolling onto its side. The beam spun across the mirrors, catching glimpses of all the horrors pressing closer, until it finally landed on something that made my heart stop completely. In one of the mirrors, I was already gone. My body hung limp in the chair, my face empty, eyes black, mouth stretched into that same silent grin. I turned to look behind me, but the chair was empty. The symbols on the floor pulsed faster, brighter, like a heartbeat beneath my knees. The last thing I felt was the hands, dozens of them grabbing me, pulling me, dragging me backward into the glass. The cold surface swallowed me whole, and then there was nothing but silence, broken only by the sound of a new reflection smiling from the other side of the mirror.